Another one coming around.
I think I'm in the bathroom anyway.
There's another one coming around this way, I think, for everybody.
Well, there's another one. She wants to start all over again. Is this yours? Just go with it.
Anybody else?
It's got them under the table. No, you don't.
Jerry, why don't you? Well, he's he'll come in when he comes.
Is that embarrassing?
Yeah, or no, just bring your candle. I don't know. What did they do? Okay, you don't have your
I wasn't told about it. Besides Sunday, you don't go on Sunday. No, never on Sunday.
I need to sign this.
Good morning, everyone. I'm
Okay,
Harriet Mesa, almost the past president. About 10 more days. And I just want to welcome everybody to this new class that Rabbi Jeff's teaching. I think there may be some new people here, and I just want to say this is a class for members of the temple and anyone who's made prior arrangements with Jeff as a guest to come and be here today. So I do want to welcome those of you who are guests, and do make prior arrangements with Jeff. It's pretty crowded. And it's wonderful, and I'm happy to see you all here. Thank you. We have a sign in.
right over here.
It's going wrong. This is the
Okay,
real
all right,
sign.
that's the real
yes.
sign?
Make
Okay.
sure you sign in. That will
Do you have a teacher's
multiple sign-ins.
Okay.
Okay.
I'll let you.
Yeah, so make sure you sign in something.
This is Sunday school teachers on it. This is Sarah. Sarah will pick up a bed. And then you sign this one, which is a regular line.
There is no doubt.
Yeah, I've been here a long time.
He's got another sign.
In stone, it's glass.
Jerry, this is the sign-in sheet that Becca said she needed for the teachers.
We have one. We have one here. Thank you. And then they're going to pass around a thumbprint sheet. We get credit for this.
Wow, thank you for coming. I think I oversold this.
So, and it's nice that this kind of story.
Harriet already said hello? Yes. Okay, good. So the reason I'm a little bit out of breath is that I had a long time ago made a commitment to talk about a similar topic to a group of people from Federation who have been studying the Torah line by line for 10 years. So because of that, I was able to just like slide in here. So I apologize for being late, but that was something I had agreed to a long time ago. And they were gracious enough to work the time around me when we decided to do this. So welcome to this very interesting class. I will tell you, I guess you'll decide whether it was interesting or not. But I will tell you that to me, this is probably the most interesting thing that I could talk about. Because, and it's my favorite topic of all. Because I love Jewish history, and I love the real Jewish history. So I had to just now do a spiel for these folks at Federation who have been studying the Torah line by line for 10 years about how our approach should at least sit side by side with their approach. I wrote about this on my blog this week. The idea that we can learn from the Torah and the Bible in a different way than is conventionally taught is something that is not universally accepted. You'll learn in the course of this class about, for instance, the 4 primary sources of the Torah. We call them J, E, P, and D. And those are 4 letters that you are going to become sick of by the time we're done. And I had a rabbi in town say to me not that long ago, when I said, well, what about the historical critical approach to the Bible? And he said, you mean J-E-P-D, who cares? And to me, that's like saying, who cares about real Jewish history? For him, it was more important to enshrine the covenant of Abraham in the psyche of the Jewish people than it was to talk about the fact that Abraham didn't exist and that there was, more importantly, a reason why he was created, which is what's interesting to us. So I don't have to make the apologies to you guys that I have to make to them. We're studying this because for us, the Bible, it is not the history of the Jews. It is a key to the history of the ancient Israelites and the emerging Jewish world. Now, this is a really complicated topic. And I test drove this with 2 Federation classes that I taught last year. And I can tell you that even these people who are Jewish studies junkies and really knew the Torah and the Bible, they sometimes got a little bit lost. So I learned a little bit from where they got lost, but it may not be the exact places that you guys get lost. And there are a few things I'm going to do with you that I didn't do with them, and part of that is going to be just going through the Tanakh. We do not have enough copies of this book for everybody, because I didn't anticipate more than 20 people coming. So honestly, I'm going to highly, highly recommend every Jewish home, I don't care how humanistic you are, every Jewish home should own a copy of this book. This is the Tanakh. I'll talk about why it's named that. The Holy Scriptures, the latest edition by the Jewish Publication Society. We call it the JPS Bible. There are 4,000 translations of the Hebrew Scriptures or the Old Testament. This one is known to scholars as the new JPS. Search this on Amazon. There are a whole bunch of different versions of it. You can get little pocket ones, big giant leather-bound ones, and everything in between. But if you don't own it, you probably should, and you're definitely going to need it for this class, and apparently we only own a few copies, but I will tell you they haven't all been taken. Oh, maybe I'm wrong. Never mind. Here maybe is one more? No, that's the Jewish Study Bible. Never mind. This does have the same translation if anybody wants it. The pages we're not going to struggle with, so if there's somebody who needs... Okay. Everybody has one?
Period.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, so we're actually going to start at the end. We're going to start at the end because we want to understand what this literature is and what prompted the people who wrote it or the people who compiled it to do so and preserve it. So I'm going to ask everybody, and I have the Tanakh on my computer, I'm going to ask everybody to turn to the book of 2 Kings.
Book of 2 Kings. Is there an index?
So you can look in the table of contents is a good place. Yes, and the pages don't always match up. So 2 Kings, we're looking at chapter 25, so that's actually the last chapter. And verse, I believe, verse 8.
2 Kings 25.
Chapter 25 of the 2nd book of Kings, verse 8.
6:11.
6:11.
6:11.
Oh, I can actually announce them because my Kindle version is using the same
Oh, wait a
pages.
minute. She
That's
said
6:11.
6:11.
she said 577.
That was the beginning of the book.
No, yeah, it's chapter 25.
So we'll get better at this. We will get better at this. This is an important skill to develop, is how to find these books, okay? But I understand that it's not the easiest thing when you're starting out. The year is 586 BCE. The place is Jerusalem. The setting is the end of the war with the Babylonians, who have come in to capture the last remaining remnant of what can now be properly called Jews, because they are Judeans and they live in Judah or Judea. And this is what happened. On the 7th day of the 5th month, that was the 19th year of King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, Nebuzaradan, the chief of the guards, an officer of the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. He burned the house of the Lord of Yahweh, the king's palace, and all the houses of Jerusalem he burned down. The house of every notable person. The entire Chaldean force that was with the chief of the guard tore down the walls of Jerusalem on every side. The remnant of the people that was left in the city, the defectors who had gone over to the king of Babylon, and the remnant of the population were taken into exile by Nebuzaradan, the chief of the guards. Only the poorest in the land were left by the chief of the guards to be vine dressers and field hands. Just as a note, I will always try to read slowly and clearly. So if you don't get to the section, don't panic. Just listen, and you'll get the same idea, because we are going to be looking at a lot of verses. It's the only way you can teach this stuff. What's going on here? What's happened?
It's the beginning of the Babylonian exile.
This is the beginning of the Babylonian exile. In the year 722 BCE, remember that in the BCE we count down instead of up. In the year 722 BCE, a similar fate had overtaken the northern kingdom known as Israel. But they had not been taken into exile. They were taken away into captivity forever. You sometimes know them as the 10 lost tribes of Israel. They are gone. They will never be heard from again. But this group, this remnant, who mostly live in Jerusalem and the area around it, who survived that same war in 722, only 100 and some odd years, 150 years later, to be exposed to the ravages of a new kingdom, not Assyria to the north, but Babylon, lying to their east, has now undergone the same fate. They, however, will enter Babylon as a community. And this is the beginning of the Jewish story, but the end, in many ways, of the scriptural story. If you are going into this exile, and your future is unknown to you, you have no idea what's going to become of you, what is your main concern? What are you thinking about? You can do it, just put on something. What are you thinking about? Survival. How will I survive? And how do we survive? I mean, Humanistic Jews, we understand this. How do we survive? What keeps us going?
Language.
Well, I was going for something broader, but you're right. You're right on the more technical base. I was talking about hope. I was talking about hope. Out of despair comes hope. So turn to
Jeff,
yes.
Quick question. So the reference to the Chaldeans.
Yes, that is a name for the Babylonians.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
I was thinking Chaldea is in part of Iraq.
Chaldea. This is Iraq.
Well, this is
Babylon is Iraq. Babylon is Iraq.
Are they the same Chaldeans that lived like in Dearborn?
Unless they've lived an extraordinarily long life. Not exactly. No, but that is where they get their name from, of course. Babylon was an ancient kingdom. It was renewed again. The Neo-Babylonian kingdom was sometimes called Chaldea. That whole area can be understood as Iraq, as Babylon, as Chaldea. But it's this big kingdom to the east. That's where we're talking about. Actually, Jerry, if you don't mind, could you open this one too?
Sure.
I'm dying to heat over here. Okay, so now I'm going to ask you to turn to the book of Psalms. Now, the book of Psalms is in the last third of the Bible. And you're going to turn to the 137th Psalm, which I believe, if my imagination is correct, is on page 1272.
Right.
Okay. My Kindle doesn't always match up, but I think it does this time.
1272.
Yeah, 1272.
Right, you're there already?
And again, if you didn't find it yet, I'm going to read slowly, but I want to just be able to make some progress. By the rivers of Babylon,
It is. Here we go.
there we sat and wept as we thought of Zion. There on the poplars we hung up our lyres, our harps. For our captors asked us there for songs, our tormentors for amusement. Sing us one of the songs of Zion. How can we sing a song of Yahweh on alien soil? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Let my tongue stick to my palate. If I seek to think of you, if I do not keep Jerusalem in memory, even at my happiest hour. Remember, O Lord, against the Edomites the day of Jerusalem's fall, how they cried, strip her to her very foundations. We won't read the last part. This is their hope, their despair. And out of this despair will rise hope. What they have done in leaving Babylon is they have carried some very small, precious remnants of their culture. And those remnants are texts. They have texts. Scroll after scroll of ancient, to them already, ancient writings that they will carry into Babylon. And that over the course of 100 years or so, they will begin to stitch into what we now call the Jewish Bible, the Holy Scriptures, the Tanakh. So let's visit this document, let's take a tour, and to do that, you need to go to your table of contents. That one hopefully will be easy for everyone to find. So I apologize if this is basic for some of you guys, but I do feel like we need to talk about the book itself.
Table of contents.
There are three basic parts to the Hebrew Scriptures, to the Old Testament, okay? And of course, everybody knows why we tend not to call it the Old Testament.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So the three parts are the Torah. And you can see in your table of contents, hopefully everybody's the most familiar with those books. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Then we have a section that in Hebrew is known as the Nevi'im. Nevi'im translates into English as prophets. Not all of these are texts written by the prophets. This includes a significant amount of historical material. I should add highly tendentious historical material, extremely biased, written from one point of view. Unfortunately, with the exception of some extra biblical texts, which we are fortunate to have dug up out of the soil, it is the only surviving old document telling us about the period that it describes. And then finally, there are a collection of texts known as the Ketuvim. Ketuvim means, anybody know? The writings. Okay, you guys do know this. Put it together, you have an acronym made up of T, N, and in the middle of a word, this becomes not a K, but a Ch. And what do we get?
Tanakh.
Tanakh. And that's how we're going to call it from now on, the Tanakh. So here's a few other facts to know about the Tanakh in terms of its final arrangement as we have it. The Torah is certainly one of the oldest texts, but its composition is contemporaneous with the history that's told later. That is to say that there was no Moses. There was no Abraham. There was none of that we've come to think about in very conventional or mythological ways of understanding the composition of this text. You'll get exact years at some point. I'll present them to you about when things happened. But know that this is the mythology that was created during the period of history that is described in the subsequent text, which takes us to the Nevi'im. The Nevi'im purport to tell us what happened to these Israelites after they came out of Egypt, which they never were in, and how they conquered a land, which they never did conquer, and how they set up the political system, which is not terribly, horribly incorrectly described in these texts, although, again, very tendentiously. And so we see the books there are Joshua, which tells of the conquest. We'll look at that a little bit. The book of Judges, which may actually contain some of the oldest biblical writings that we have, and some of the oldest accurate memories of certain tribal tales that took place. The books of 1 and 2 Samuel, which basically are one book divided into two for the sake of carrying them around in scrolls, probably. Those tell the story of King Saul, King David, and King Solomon. The books of 1 and 2 Kings, which tell the story of the divided kingdom after Solomon's death, when the northern kingdom became one thing and the southern kingdom another, and all the way through to what we just read. And then you have all of these prophetic texts. These prophetic texts came out of specific schools. Some of these schools are responsible for certain theologies and ideologies and political ideas that we will uncover in the Torah itself. Some of it comes from them. They lived contemporaneously with many of the events. They're not historians, but occasionally and importantly, they mention an event. They certainly frequently mention a king that they served under, that they were associated with, whose time they lived in, and they tell the story from a different angle. This helps us, by the way, to corroborate a little bit what happened, at least from their point of view. The biggies are Isaiah, who's really 3, but we won't get into that level of detail in this class. Jeremiah, who lived at the time of the events that we just read about, the exile, and was key during that time. And Ezekiel, who lived during the exile, and was part of what gave hope, and also an enormous amount of weird text to us about the future. Then we have all these little guys here. They're not little. They're really important. Some of them are more important than others. Some of them were real. Some of them were fictional. Jonah is just a storybook. But Amos, is a really important piece of theological evidence from ancient times. We're not going to spend a lot of time in there, but I wanted you to see what these were and how they work. And then finally we get to the Ketuvim. Some of the Ketuvim, some of the writings, actually post-date the events that we just learned about from 586 BCE. But most of them don't. We have, for instance, an ancient Israelite prayer book, combined with, who knows, hundreds of years of Israelite prayers and longings and ideas attributed to King David. Of course, that's mythology. The book of Psalms. The books of Psalms, really. These probably originated as chanting psalms, prayers, and so forth over the course of time in the ancient temples. We have Proverbs, which came after the events that I talked about. We have Job, which came after the events that I've talked about. We have the Song of Songs, which is, we often say Esther is the only book without God in it. Song of Songs is close to it has just a very brief mention. Song of Songs is erotic poetry. And I mean erotic poetry. Doesn't sound that hot today because, you know, comparing somebody's breasts to gazelles is really doesn't really get people too much under the collar. But back in those days, that was some serious stuff. We have the book of Ruth, which even though it takes place long before King David, was also written after the exile. We'll talk about that at some point. We have the book of Lamentations, which is about the very thing that we just heard. It is about the destruction of Jerusalem, an historical event that can be absolutely corroborated by external evidence, by the way. We have tons of evidence by it. You can't visit it now because for some reason it's been closed for several years, but you can even go into Jerusalem, into an archaeological site called the Israelite Tower, and see the burn marks on the walls that have been carbon dated to 586 BCE in this destruction. You have the book of Ecclesiastes, Kohelet, also wisdom literature that came later. You have the book of Esther, a later book. You have the book of Daniel, a later book. And you have the book of Ezra, which tells about the man, and Nehemiah, they're the same books. Same book, just with two different titles as an intermission, that tells about the man who many people, I think it's a little simplistic, but many people ascribe or attribute the final redaction of the Torah to him. Some people say, and I agree with this, that he was at least the man who led the school that put the whole thing together. And then finally, two repetitions of Israelite history that came much later, called the Chronicles, that we're not going to bother ourselves with at all. Okay, so that's a little bit of a tour, and again, I apologize to those of you who already knew this stuff. So what we're going to do next is we're going to, let me see, we did that. We're going to talk about, really start to talk about who wrote the Bible. So, who did you guys learn wrote, let's just stick to the Torah for a minute. Who did you learn when you were growing up, if you weren't humanistic Jews, who did you learn wrote the Torah?
God.
Okay.
It was divinely inspired.
Divinely inspired. Moses. Right? Moses.
I didn't learn that.
Okay. But that was the biggie. That was the biggie for a long time. There's a lot of reasons for that. We'll talk about some of them. Sometimes it's called Torat Moshe, the Torah of Moses, right? That's one of the most common ways for religious Jews to talk about this text. But I should point out that the Torah itself never once claims that Moses wrote it. So where did people get this idea? Oops. Okay. Got to go back. I'm sorry. I'm scrolling through a funny way now because I keep going back and forth. All right. We're going to look at where the Torah might have given people this idea. And again, we're going to go pretty fast through these texts, so don't feel that you have to necessarily go find them, all right? But if you're good at this and you want to go to Exodus 17, verse 4, you will find it. I'm sorry, Exodus 17, verse 14. Exodus 17, verse 14.
Okay.
112.
Page 112. What page?
It's on
No, I don't know.
page 112. Yahweh, and whenever it says Lord in all capital letters, it says Yahweh. Yud He Vav He, the tetragrammaton in the Torah. Then Yahweh said to Moses, inscribe this in a document as a reminder and read it aloud to Joshua. I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. That's one of the first mentions that we'll talk about today where Moses does any writing. But does this say that he wrote the Torah?
No.
What's he being instructed here to write about? A specific incident in which the Jews, or the Israelites, I'm going to try to use more exacting terms, in which the Israelites were supposedly attacked by this evil nation known as Amalek, which goes on to have a long history with our people. Haman is called an Amalekite. Hitler is called an Amalekite, even in Jewish tradition now. So that's one example. If you go forward to Exodus 24:4, so that's just a few chapters ahead. And that one's on page 122, I believe.
Yes.
It says, Moses went and repeated to the people all of the commands of Yahweh and all the rules, and all the people answered with one voice, saying, all the things that Yahweh has commanded we will do. Moses then wrote down all the commands of Yahweh. Well, does that tell us that Moses wrote the whole Torah? No. Because if you read it in context, what it tells us is that he wrote down the commandments that were just given. Just a few sentences earlier, beginning in Exodus 20. In Exodus 34:28, and again, only if you can get there quickly. I don't want to dray your cup with going through the pages a lot.
140.
140.
Yes. 140.
Okay, so you find it in 34 verse 28, which is on page 140. And Yahweh said to Moses, write down these commandments, for in accordance with these commandments, I make a covenant with you and with Israel. But again, this doesn't say, right, he wrote down the whole Torah. All right, just a couple more examples of where people got this from. If I can just stay on the same page. I'm sorry. I did this a different way, but I had a written text last time. Every time I go back and forth. I'll give you a few more examples. Moses wrote their goings out according to their journeys by the commandments of the Lord. This is found in Numbers 33. And then it refers to Moses recording the journeys that the Israelites took. In Deuteronomy 31, Moses wrote this law, don't go there, and gave it to the priests, the sons of Levi, the ones carrying the Ark of the Covenant. Moses finished writing the words of this law on a scroll. This goes on and on. We have several examples of this, and I'm really not going to dray your cup with it. But this is and created the situation where Jews for thousands of years came to believe that Moses wrote the Torah. But ascribing the Torah to Moses is not, as we've seen, substantiated by the text. It happens that this is an ancient practice. Everybody did this. Authorizing a politically or religiously oriented text by assigning its authorship to an ancestral hero was common practice. This is what people did. Because this is what then allowed people to consider it a holy or divine text. I'm awfully sorry. I don't know why. Every time I push one button here, my page goes away. And it's starting to drive me up the wall. I have 160 pages of notes. So you can only guess how much this, you're not going to get them all, but I would just love to know why this keeps happening. Okay, the first time that we encounter a real, unequivocal statement of Mosaic authorship actually comes from the rabbis. So the rabbis lived hundreds and hundreds of years later. And in the Babylonian Torah it says this. Rabbi Yochanan asserted that the Torah was given to Moses in a series of small scrolls. So how did they interpret this? The Torah was written gradually through the 40 years that the Israelites were in the desert. It was dictated to Moses, and at the end of those 40 years, he combined the Torah into one long scroll, and it continues in the Talmud. Reish Lakish said the Torah was then given sealed. In other words, this was the written Torah. Now you know later the rabbis will develop the idea of an interpretive tradition that was also given, which they call the oral Torah. They have to do this, because if this is all we got, we are, pardon the expression, screwed. Because it is very, very difficult to tell how you're supposed to live your life from these 5 books. I mean, after all, even during the rabbinical era, they weren't necessarily interested in chopping off hands of people who robbed. It wasn't Saudi Arabia. They weren't interested in poking out eyes. So they had to come up with new ways to interpret things and say that that's what the Torah meant when it was given sealed. So that's where the oral Torah comes from, but that's a different class. they continued to spread this idea. Another example, this one comes from the Talmud as well. Moses, servants of God, died on the Torah, but now they had a question. Moses dies in the Torah. How does he write a book where his demise is at the end of the book? This is not just a problem for us. This was a problem for them too. So this is the beginning of questioning the idea that the Torah was written entirely by Moses. So maybe some of you know, what would you say if you believed the Torah was written by Moses, but his death scene is included? What could you possibly come up with?
You could see the future written by somebody else.
Those chapters were written by somebody else is a very good guess.
He could see the future. He knew.
He could see the future. The truth is that both of those were provided as possible answers. There was one rabbi who said, well, Joshua, who you know was his heir, right? The military heir. Joshua took over. And only that piece was unwritten by Moses. And he wrote the rest. But my favorite is this. The opinion that said, when God, who was dictating this after all, when God got to that part, he stopped. And then he continued. And Moses wrote it. And he wrote it in tears. So your answer is correct and your answer is correct. He wrote it in tears. Okay. This was the idea because the Torah had to come from heaven. The rabbis taught that one who maintains that the Torah was not divinely revealed was a heretic. And what was the punishment for a heretic? Nope, not burning.
Excommunication.
Yeah.
Yes, but excommunication really had, that's all very Catholic-y and you can't take communion language. They called it something else. They called it karet. Karet meant you were cut off from the world to come. You were now exiled, not from your community, you were exiled from God and the future of the Jewish people. The folks that were deniers of the divinity of the Torah scroll from heaven were also given another name. Anybody know what that one was?
Epikuros.
Apikoros. Apikoros. Now that's a name that we should wear with pride. Apikoros. Anybody know the origination of the name Apikoros?
Epicurus.
Epicurus. I'm going to actually talk a little bit about Epicurus. I believe on July 10th I'm going to talk about the book The Swerve and the discovery of a book called On the Nature of Things by Lucretius, in which he basically uses Epicurean theology. Okay. Just going to skip ahead. So, in the Enlightenment era, people started to question this. They knew that there were these traditions of attributing books to ancient heroes. But they also knew that books were named for people who didn't necessarily write them. Sometimes they were just named for the main character. Esther didn't write Esther. Ruth didn't write Ruth. And more importantly, Moses himself, nowhere in the Torah, ever claimed to have written it. And very early on, some people began to question this, way before you would even think that they would. But really, it was the Enlightenment. So what were some questions that they would ask? They're the questions that we would ask. What led them to doubt that Moses had written it?
Said he died.
He died, that was one reason. What were some other possibilities? This was really groundbreaking. For us, this seems like, who cares, so what? But this was groundbreaking to suggest this in the Enlightenment. There were other problems, and these are the problems that we're going to explore in this class. Why is he referred to all the time in the third person? Who writes like that? If you're going to write a book about yourself, chances are you're going to write it in the first person.
But is God dictating repeating it.
Well, that was the excuse that they'd come up with, but that wasn't working for the Enlightenment people anymore. How about this one? Why are there so many names for God? God has dozens of ways that he's described in the Torah and the entire Bible. But there are at least 2 or 3 major names by which he's described. Why are there so many different versions of the same story? Why are there repetitions? Why are there so many weird things that happen? Abraham, and we're not going to look at the text, but Abraham's son and the annunciation of his birth is described in 3 different chapters in 3 different ways. We have, weirdly, one episode involving a patriarch and his wife, where the patriarch pretends that his wife is his sister, although in Abraham's case, there's textual evidence to indicate. Encountering a king, the patriarch says to his wife, pretend you're my sister because he's going to think you're hot. And then he's going to want to be with you. And I don't want to get killed because he wants to be with you. Now, if this happened in your family one time, you remember it, right? I mean, if Zeta told the story of the time that he and Bubby were visiting Odessa, and the mayor was really into Bubby, and he said, pretend you're my sister, because otherwise he'll kill me, this would be a tradition your family would remember. And you most certainly would not do it a second time with another king, because the outcome of the first time is you almost got killed by the Pharaoh who you did it to, and now you're going to turn to a Canaanite, a Philistine actually, and to do it again. And then, it wasn't enough that it happened twice to you, it's going to happen to your son? This is absurd. And people began to realize that this was a problem. One of the worst problems was the creation story. There are 2 creation stories. We are so used to reading them together that over thousands of years, people stopped noticing that they were 2 separate creation stories. They just assumed that one was the kind of big, giant outward look, and the other one was like in a movie, you came in really close and then you saw what was going on, except that they contradict each other. They have details where one says this happened on this day and one says this happened on this day. And never mind the fact that both stories are ludicrous in terms of how the world could have come into being. They don't match up. They're like this. What God, what creator of the universe would dictate a unified story in which the very beginning has 2 completely different versions? It gets worse. We look at the story of Noah, which I just taught to this group of people in West Bloomfield. The story of Noah. Anybody ever just sat down to try to read the story of Noah? The story of Noah seems like it'd be an easy story to understand, right? I mean, we teach the story. We don't teach the story. But I will never teach the story to a pre-K or a first grader. And if it's ever been done here before, those of you who are teachers, you should know that's not our new curriculum. We're not going to introduce that story until much later now. First of all, it's a horrifying story, but more than it being a horrifying story, it is a very, very incoherent story. It simply has too many things that don't track. We're not going to do it right now, but at some point we are going to look at the Noah story. And when you see the Noah story and you read it through as a unified text, your eyes just go in circles like this. How many animals were taken on the ark? How many animals were taken on the ark?
2 of each.
2 of each, except there's another part where it says that there were 7 of certain ones. How many days did it flood?
40.
Right, that's what you remember, but another part says 150. What kind of animal was sent out to discover whether there was dry land?
A raven.
A raven, a dove, a raven. Who the hell knows? Because there's a raven, then there's a dove, and then there's another dove, and that dove never comes back, and it's absolutely incoherent. Where did the flooding come from? It rained, except in the other version, it came from the top and it also came from the bottom. Bubbled up in great fountains. What happened at the end?
Someone gets drunk.
What before that? You got a rainbow, except in another version you don't get a rainbow. You get a whole bunch of sacrifices. The story is incoherent. And what happened was, when you read it this way, as a unified text, the story doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It doesn't track. Now, if you're one of the ancient rabbis, you're going to say, oh, but there are lessons contained therein. And this is how, I had to be respectful this morning of a process that, while I find it historically fascinating, no longer has resonance for me. I'm not looking to learn lessons from these contradictions of how to live my life. But when you pull the story apart, all of a sudden, if you read these lines together and these lines together, you have two perfectly understandable versions of the same story that track 100% perfectly, and that if you know who wrote this one and you know who wrote this one, all of a sudden you learn something very, very important about your history. So we're actually going to look at that story. We don't even know, according to the Torah, what the name of the damn mountain was. Where was the Torah revealed? Except there's many places in the Torah that call it something else altogether.
Horeb?
Horeb, exactly. The Enlightenment thinkers who have now given up on this are beginning to ask these questions. There are anachronisms, there are geographic anomalies, there are phrases that could only have come from later Hebrew. There are events that not only happen at the same time as Moses' death, they happen years after Moses died. There are not one, not two, but 3 sets of 10 commandments. Was anybody here on the Friday night that I did the 10 commandments?
Yeah.
Okay, so one of the things you learned is that there were 2 that look a lot like the 10 commandments that we think are the ones that all of our fundamentalist friends love and that they put on monuments, which, by the way, are not a version of any of the 3. They're completely different. They are redacted versions of a King James, poorly translated version of the 10 Commandments. I'll leave that aside. That's what's sitting on Alabama that's so holy. But those two of the versions are kind of the same, with some significant differences that are important. And one of the versions is completely different, and is still called these 10 Commandments. How do you explain that? Talked about the doublets and the triplets of the different stories and so forth. Okay, the first time this was questioned was actually in the medieval era. It was Ibn Ezra. Avraham Ibn Ezra was a Sephardic commentator. Now I want you to take a look, now we're going to go to the Bible, I want you to take a look at Genesis 12, chapter 6. I'm sorry, Genesis chapter 12, verse 6.
Page.
Give them 1 second. Chapter 12, verse 6 is going to be on page 1718, somewhere in there.
18.
Oh, that's Exodus.
Genesis, page 18, very, very early in the book. It's an unimportant narrative as far as we're concerned. The narrative isn't the point. They're talking about Avram, that was his original name in the story, where he went in terms of settlement and so forth. He's sort of wandering through the northern part on his way to the south, which is where most of his narratives take place, because he was written by a southern author that we're going to learn about. And it says, Avram passed through the land as far as the site of Shechem, at the terebinth of Morch. The Canaanites were then in the land. This became one of the most important verses in the history of biblical criticism. The Canaanites were then. What's wrong with this verse? The Canaanites were then in the land.
It didn't exist then.
If Moses is writing this, where were the Canaanites? If Moses is writing this text, where do the Canaanites live? In the land. It's like me writing a story about what's going on here at the Birmingham Temple, and but I'm writing it 400 years from now. I'm writing it now, and I'm saying, and that's when the Birmingham Temple used to exist. Why would I write now? That's when the Birmingham Temple used to exist. If the Birmingham Temple now exists, I wouldn't write that. Well, this was a problem for Ibn Ezra. There were other similar verses, but this one really hung him up. He could not figure out why Moses would say that's when the Canaanites used to live there. When the Canaanites are so far from not living there, they're hundreds of years away from not living there anymore. And of course, they never were truly expelled, but they certainly aren't expelled at this point. Not expelled at the time of Abram, not the time of Moses. The only person that would write that Abram went through the land when the Canaanites used to be there is someone who lives at a time when the Canaanites are no longer there. So, Ibn Ezra says this, well, maybe Moses meant that the Canaanites captured the land right after this. So he was really saying, well, that's when the Canaanites came in and started doing their capturing. But he doesn't like that idea. And so he says something else. Maybe this isn't so. And he adds a verse, adds a line to his commentary. Hamevid Yidom. The one who understands this will keep his mouth shut. That's what he says. There are a couple other places where he uses Hamaskil Yavin and things like that. The enlightened person will understand. Now, Ibn Ezra didn't take this all the way to the limit. He just said it's a great secret and we're not going to talk about it. But along comes another guy in the 17th century and he has stopped giving two hoots about secrets and wise people being quiet. And he's a hero of ours. His name is Baruch Spinoza. And Baruch Spinoza, he's going to be the first Jew not to keep his mouth shut about this. And he becomes, for us, actually he is the first biblical critical historian. He's the first person to teach this class. And here's what he says. In Genesis 12:6, the historian, that's who he's referring to, the person who wrote the Torah, after narrating that Abraham journeyed through the land of Canaan, adds, and the Canaanite was then in the land, thus clearly excluding the time at which he wrote. So that this passage must have been written after the death of Moses, when the Canaanites had been driven out and no longer possessed the land. Ibn Ezra, who lived several hundred years before him, in his commentary on the passage alludes to the difficulty, and then he gives Ibn Ezra's understanding, and this, let him who understands it keep silence. So if Canaan invaded those regions, as he's complaining, the sense would be that the Canaanite was then in the land. But if it follows from Genesis chapter 10, well, the Canaanite was already in the land. They were the first ones in the land. So the text must mean to exclude the time present. That is the time at which it was written. Therefore, it cannot be the work of Moses, in whose time the Canaanites still possessed those territories. This is the mysterious thing that Ibn Ezra was telling you to shut up about, that I'm now writing a book about. I will say this, Spinoza did not publish this book until after he died. But it didn't help him, because what happened to poor Spinoza? He was seriously excommunicated, and he didn't really care anymore. There were a number of these kinds of things, but let me just tell you about some of the anachronisms that subsequent people noticed and that we're going to also talk about as keys to understanding who wrote the Bible. These are things that we've been discovering over the last 50, 60, 70, 80, 100 so years. Genesis 26 introduces us to a group of people who are going to be around for a long time in this story, called the Philistines. You've heard about them, right? It's, by the way, where the Romans decided to get the idea to name the land Palestina, and why it became known as Palestine. It was because they didn't want the Judean connection anymore. And we're still suffering from that little piece of political, historical revisionism. The Philistines supposedly exist in the time of the patriarchs. The time of the patriarchs is approximately 1800 years BCE. There's a very, very big problem with this. There were no Philistines in the land of Israel in 1800 BCE. We know who the Philistines were. We know where they came from, and we know when they got there. They came from the Aegean. They were known as the Sea Peoples. They were basically related to the Greeks, distantly related to the Greeks, and they landed on the coast of Israel in the south, near Ashkelon, Ashdod, that area, around the year 1200 BCE. This was a very important year in human history. One of the most important eras was this 13th century BCE. We know this because we've dug this up. Nobody ever expected when they were talking about these things that we were going to tear up the land. Now, when they first went in to tear up the land, what were they looking for? They were looking, not gold, no. Well, a kind of gold. They were looking for substantiation that what the Torah was saying was true. Biblical archaeology, which is not the proper name, although I'll use it repeatedly, but it's not the proper name for this particular school of thought. Biblical archaeology went in with a Bible in one hand and a spade in the other. And it was their goal to find, and at first, a lot of the things they discovered, they thought made sense. But over time, when newer techniques came about, carbon dating and all of those other kinds of things, they began to realize that some of the things they discovered not only didn't confirm what the Bible said, they contradicted. And this was huge, this Philistine thing. Because they never shut up about the Philistines in the Bible at the patriarchal period. Why would they talk about it at the patriarchal period? Why would they place them there? Because, and now you're going to hear for the first time who wrote the Bible, the people who lived during the kingdom of Saul and David and Solomon in the 11th, 10th, 9th century BCE, whose story is told in those books of Samuel and books of Kings, who was one of their biggest pains in the ass? The Philistines. They were the ones having trouble with the Philistines. By the way, everyone in that area was having trouble with these sea peoples. It's probably why Egypt began to have all kinds of problems. It's definitely why the northern areas, southern Lebanon, those areas today began to have trouble. And they were constantly fighting the Philistines. When they wrote stories about Abraham and the Philistines, they were writing stories about their own day. There are famous stories, for instance, one in particular that's coming to mind, about when Abraham, it comes right after, by the way, the whole incident with Hagar. You know, Abraham's maidservant who's cast out, etc. It's kind of a cruel story. But then there's this interesting tale about a conflict with these Philistines over a well. Well, if you look at the well, where the well is described as being, that well, that area, represents a southern conflict point between the ancient Judean kingdom under the time of David, Saul, and Solomon, and the Philistines. So it wasn't about Abraham and the Philistines, who were 600 years away from setting sail to the coast of Israel. It was really about Judah and its issues with this southern kingdom. Where was this well? It was approximately in the area of Beersheba. Beersheba, if you know on the Israel map, is in the south. Where did the Philistines live? Also in the south. The Philistines were to the southwest. By the way, all these Israeli cities today, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Philistine cities. And if you've been to that part of Israel, you know that these are areas of flashpoints between the Philistines, according to the archaeological surveys, between the Philistines and the Judeans. So who's going to write a story about their ancient patriarch dealing with these people? The folks that are dealing with these people. That's who wrote it. Now we get to other problems, anachronisms, the camels. So a couple of years ago, everybody got very excited here and everywhere else I was, telling me that they had just discovered that there were no camels, domesticated camels, in the land of Israel in the days of the patriarchs. Again, about 1800 BCE. This wasn't news to me. I knew about this because they taught this to me in rabbinical school. In my very first year of rabbinical school, almost my very first day of rabbinical school, in my Bible class in Jerusalem, the professor said, Michael Klein, who was also the dean of the Jerusalem campus, said, well, and of course this is not true because there were no camels domesticated in those days. We know that. The reason it made the New York Times is because Tel Aviv University, using new methods and new techniques, had done some and I didn't even understand how this was done, because this was done by biologists and archaeologists working together. They had dug up the remains of camels, et cetera, and at the end of the day, you can go read. I actually read the study. It was very difficult. There's a lot of chemical stuff in there about carbon dating and all this stuff. But you can find the New York Times article too. Maybe I'll bring it next time if you're interested. At the end of the day, what did they determine? There were no domesticated camels in the land of Israel in the 18th, 19th centuries BCE. They don't come into the land of Israel until, guess when? Around the time, or slightly before the time, that these stories were written. So, if you're going to write a story about your ancient ancestor, who has a border dispute with the Philistines who don't even exist yet, you don't know any of this. Your reality is that there are Philistines. So they must have existed back then. The same thing applies to the camels. They didn't live in with the same kind of historical awareness that we do. Today, if we write a story that takes place in the 15th century, we're not going to put a car there. That's ludicrous.
Or a cell phone.
Or a cell phone. Did anybody notice in my Haggadah, in the illustrations, they were all taken from medieval Haggadahs, right? And many of them were illustrations of stuff from Egypt and the slavery story and all that. Anybody notice, and maybe you've seen these in other places, these are very, very famous pictures. What did you notice about those pictures? Pictures of the slaves in Egypt, pictures of Moses, of the dividing of the sea. They were all dressed like medieval people. They were all dressed like medieval people. The people living in the 14th century or the 13th century who were drawing these beautiful Haggadahs, they had absolutely no notion that people dressed differently. I'll tell a little funny story, because this lack of historicity, for a people that's supposed to be all about our history, we are one of the most ahistorical peoples on the earth. This is one of my favorite stories, and I apologize if you've heard it before. It happened when I was at the JCC, and a little boy, the Chabad rabbis would send their kids to our JCC, because all the other preschools were worse than us. They hadn't established their own yet. So it's Purim, and little Moishi from the JCC, there was always a little Moishi because he had 400 children, and we always had one in the preschool, or two, or four. He's dressed in little Chabad rabbi clothing, and it's Purim. And so I go up to him and I say, I love your costume, you're dressed like Daddy. And he looked at me, he was angry. I'm not dressed like Daddy, I'm dressed like Mordechai. Subsequently, I saw a cartoon of the Jews going through the Red Sea on dry land, and what are they wearing? Black hats and coats. So, if you don't understand how our ancient biblical writers would mistake the camels, think about the fact that people still do this. Not just medieval Jews drawing pretty Haggadahs, but 21st century Chabadniks who own a giant building on Maple. I don't know that all those guys think that way, but this is an actual frame of reference that people continue to use. They are extraordinarily ahistorical in that way. But from our perspective, we can't laugh at the people who in the 10th century would naturally believe that camels were the most important mode of transportation. Camels revolutionized the entire area. How so, by the way?
Water.
Yeah, you could go over long distances, right? In fact, the stories of the migration of Abraham make a lot more sense if he's on a camel. Think about the land he's crossing from northern Chaldea, Babylon, to get to the land of Israel. There ain't a lot of water between there and there. So it makes a whole lot of sense. So the people who write the Bible are telling the story as they understand it. If you take a look, well, we're not going to look at it, but even the way they understood the economy of their ancestors. There's a great little section in Genesis 37, which we're not going to read, but it's the Joseph story. And these camels, these Ishmaelites, are in a caravan, and what are they carrying? Gum and balm and myrrh. Who sold gum and balm and myrrh in the 18th century BCE? Nobody. These were not products that we know to have existed on any trade route at that time, and certainly not the non-existent Arabian camel trade route, which couldn't possibly have been because there were no Arabian domesticated camels coming up that way. By the way, the Arabs did have domesticated camels. It was the so-called advanced Israelites who did not have them in the 18th century BCE. Those are products that were very common on economic trade routes in the 8th century and the 7th century, which is when the story of Joseph was written. Written as a tale to explain how we got into Egypt and what the relationships of these various brothers were. We have so much more, all kinds of geopolitical anachronisms, and I'm skipping through a lot of stuff now because this was a much longer course when I did it for Federation, but let's take it to today. How do modern scholars now, with all this information and more in hand, how do they approach this text? Well, to us this doesn't seem like that big a revolution. But you know that there are still people fighting all the time over this, right? This is one of the most contentious things. And if a Reform rabbi is going to tell me JEPD, who cares? Imagine what a fundamentalist a Christian is going to say, or an Orthodox rabbi. When these guys sat down, and they were mostly guys, now there's a lot of women involved, they decided to begin to approach this text like any other ancient text. Whatever people want to do with it religiously is their business. But if we're going to approach this properly, we have to divorce ourselves from it. So, there are various techniques that they began to develop. And we're going to talk about a few of those techniques right now. First of all, we have something called the lower criticism or text criticism. I have no idea why it's called lower criticism, but that's just what biblical scholars call it, as opposed to the higher criticism. The lower criticism is text criticism. So how does text criticism work? Well, we do have archaeological remains and we do have extra biblical sources, but we don't have enough of them. So to a very great extent, we have to rely upon the text as much as possible itself. The good thing is that we have some varying manuscripts. How were books written in those days? By hand, right? And so every book was written by hand until the Gutenberg Revolution. And so for a very, very long time, people writing and even translating these texts, they left us a little bit of a treasure trove of alternative understandings. They would make mistakes, or they would include things that later people left out. So we have this wonderful translation of the Torah and the whole Bible really called the Septuagint, which is a Hellenistic Greek-Jewish translation. It's a Jewish Greek translation. The legend is, it's called the Septuagint because which is based on the word 7 or 70, because the legend is that 70 or 72 scholars each went into separate rooms to translate the Bible, and they magically appeared with the same text. In fact, what actually happened is one guy wrote the thing, and that's how it worked. Or maybe a little committee of scholars, but they definitely had meetings with each other. And so we wind up with a text that is an older manuscript, until we found the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Greek manuscript was one of the oldest that we had. It was older than any extant existing Hebrew manuscript. And if it contained some stuff that the received Hebrew manuscript didn't have, well, that was a good way for us to determine that maybe there was something different, a new contradiction, something that we have. A lot of it we do with just the words. Just the words. Language changes, right? Now, we talk a lot about biblical Hebrew is very different from modern Hebrew, but actually it's closer to modern Hebrew than Chaucer's English is to ours. Just recently listening to a a recording of some lectures about the history of English, which is something I'm just peripherally interested in. And the guy is reading from anybody ever heard Chaucer read in the original?
Wanted April with the sure suit, the drift and March.
Yeah, you can't understand that goddamn thing. It's the problem, right? So, if from the time of Chaucer to now, even from the time of Chaucer to Shakespeare, right? I think it was, what was the Great Vowel Shift or something like that? That was what sort of modernized English. Well, they had other things that happened in Hebrew, and they happened over time. Hebrew changed. So, by looking at the way the language is used, we can, to a certain extent, date the texts. So here's an interesting story. I apologize to those of you, again, who have heard it. I used to be much more traditional, as some of you know. I had a friend, an Orthodox Jew, but very modern Orthodox Jew at the University of Illinois, Nachum Dershowitz, and yes, he is a relative of the other guy. He's an Israeli, a computer scientist. University of Illinois, invented the browser, so that's what he was working on there. He's why I can go online and look things up. A very, very nice guy, and a very, very modern Orthodox Jew. And he had his little son, Idan. I went to his bar mitzvah, cute kid. Nachum later moved to Israel and became a computer science professor at Tel Aviv University. And this little cute snotty kid of his became one of the top Bible experts at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Together with a completely secular professor at Tel Aviv University, a woman, they invented a kind of software with which they can identify by writing styles who produced this text or that.
And when?
It was, sorry?
And when they produced it?
Not necessarily when in this case, but who. It was actually, they didn't invent it for this reason, they used it for forensic reasons. Because if you can identify that this letter wasn't written by that person because they used a different style of language or what, it wasn't handwriting, it was the actual language. People write differently, they express themselves differently. I'm a writer and I read books. I was reading Sherwin's book the other day, I'm thinking, how did he write this way? I could never write that way. Then people look at my writing, they say, how do you write that way? We all write in different styles. Well, Nachum and Idan and this other woman whose name I don't know because she wasn't ever a friend of mine, they decided after making a lot of money on the software and using it in investigations and for Shakespeare and all that kind of stuff, they decided to run the Torah through the thing. And guess what? They found with an unbelievable degree of similarity that the textual sources that had been identified over the course of well over 100 years, since this source theory was introduced in the 19th century, in the 19th century, the late 19th century, by a guy named Julius Wellhausen, and then developed over the course of time, that those sources, based solely upon the style of writing, matched 98% of what scholars had been proposing, based upon their tedious work for 100 years in trying to separate out these sources. I wrote about this years ago on my blog, and I heard from Nachum. And because I hadn't heard from him in years. It was very sweet, actually, because I said I used to be friends with him. He said, I hope we're still friends, and that was nice, because I'm proud to know somebody like that. And the purpose of my blog article is, how can you still believe it? And he explained, what did you say earlier? It doesn't have to be written by Moses. It could be divinely inspired. So here's a very modern Orthodox Jew, I should add. He's not at all typical, who agrees with that. So we have that, and that is one of the most important things. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of stuff that I'm skipping now. We talked about some of the versions of the Old Testament. We have others. The Samaritans, they're still a community. They may date to a sort of an admixture of those Assyrians. Remember that Assyrian exile in 722 BCE? Well, they dispersed those Israelites everywhere. But a few of them stayed in the land, probably the most poverty-stricken people, and they had a different policy. See, Babylon took you as a community, and you got to settle as a community, which is why we got Torah, because they got to settle together. But Assyrians, they brought in their own people to settle the land, and it was a big giant chaos, and those people adopted the God of Israel, and ultimately they became what we call the Samaritans, based on the name of that land, Shomron. Samaria. That's what that northern West Bank, actually. Modern day Israeli settler types. Well, and it's accurate from an ancient point of view. What do they call the territories? Judea and Samaria. Okay, so that's where those people come from. So we have a very old version from them. I mentioned the Septuagint. We have Aramaic versions of the Torah. We have a few Latin versions of the Bible. The best old version that we have wasn't discovered until the 1940s and wasn't really worked on until a little bit later than that. And those are the scrolls that were found in the caves at a place was called Qumran, that were found by a Bedouin shepherd in the caves at Qumran, and those are the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the Dead Sea Scrolls consist of a lot of stuff, a lot of really strange writings and apocalyptic weirdness, but they also have some piece of almost every text of the Bible in Hebrew, and in some cases quite extensive. And if you've been to the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, down to the, in the Shrine of the Book, you can go down there and you can see big sections of Isaiah, for instance, are on display there with a very, very carefully lit and so forth. So that is a very important source to us. By the way, it was a staggering degree of accuracy in the text that they found to the Masoretic text, which is our received text, which is hundreds and hundreds of years later. Between those two periods, we had no handwritten manuscripts. We only had copies and copies. Now, these were copies too. The oldest piece of biblical literature is one tiny little sliver of a silver scroll that goes back 2,700 years. And it's a little tiny piece of the priestly blessing. May the Lord bless you and keep you. You know that part. This is, by the way, your atheist rabbi. I recite this in its full to my daughter, one of them, every Friday night. I invoke Yahweh's blessings from a 2,700 at least year old Yahwistic blessing. I do not use the word Yahweh when I'm doing it with her. I say Adonai. We talked about historical criticism. We talked about the Philistines already, the sea peoples, the camels, etc. A very important part of doing biblical criticism, you've already seen a little bit of it. You have to talk about the people's situation as it was lived in their time. What were they struggling with? So one of the stories that we are going to look at is the story of the golden calf. You guys know this story, right? This morning I did it with these folks, and as it happens, that golden calf episode with Moses tarrying and the people demanding a God to lead them, and Aaron casting off their gold and throwing it in a fire, and out what emerges is you all saw the movie, right? This is the worst freaking thing that ever happened. This couldn't be a bigger sin.
Edward G. Robinson.
Exactly. That was Korach, though.
Right.
Korach, which was my Torah portion for my bar mitzvah, and that one's more confusing than Noah, because that's like 3 rebellion tales that have been sewn together, which makes it even harder to understand. We don't really know ever who's rebelling there. But as it happens, the first king of that northern kingdom of Israel, the one who came after Solomon, his name was Jeroboam, and he built 2 shrines. It says so right in the Bible. 2 shrines, one in Dan and one in Bethel, and he erected golden calves. And he used the same language that Aaron did. So here's an example of historical criticism. You can take and make 2 assumptions about Jeroboam. First, let me tell you a little bit about the guy. The guy's establishing a new kingdom. It's like a president who's just been elected. He's trying to get credibility. He's trying to be popular. He wants to do the right thing. He sets up a shrine in Dan because it's more convenient to the people who live in the north. He sets up a shrine, a cult, a temple, whatever you want to call it, in Beit El, which is north of Jerusalem, but further south, of course, than Dan, because he wants to make it convenient. It says in the Bible, by these people who, by the way, hated this guy, hated him, that he did this to make it convenient. And then he sets up 2 golden calves because his advisors told him to. if you're reading this Bible the way that the people who wrote it want you to, what is Jeroboam? What kind of person is he?
Wicked.
He is the worst person who ever lived. Because he is doing the worst thing that ever was done by the Jews. Historical criticism demands that we not take this man to be an imbecile. That we have to respect him in his situation. And you have to ask hard questions. Here we are in the 8th century BCE, or late 9th century BCE. The guy's establishing a new kingdom. He's trying to be popular. Even the book of Kings tells us that. It's highly unlikely that he would then do that. It's really unlikely. So if the only source that you have about Jeroboam is that he did this evil thing, well, you're going to believe that he was an evil guy. But if you consider his historical situation, you're going to come up with a very different idea. What are some of the possibilities?
That's what they worshipped.
Okay, one is that's what they worshipped, except they have a Torah telling them, don't do that.
What's Israel there then?
Ah, that's the historical criticism that I'm talking about. Now, what did they know the story? They didn't know the story. You couldn't possibly know that story and do that thing. Who would do that? Who is that stupid? No one is that stupid. And if you want to talk about who wrote the Bible, well, this right here gives us a big clue. The people who were writing the book of Kings, if they so hated this guy Jeroboam, where do you suppose they might have been from? Where do you suppose they might have lived? In the surviving kingdom, in the south. So there you have already an answer. Now it turns out we know more than that about them. But just by a simple inside the text analysis, using the external evidence of how people lived and what they were doing and that this guy existed, and we believe he did. As it turns out, by the way, it wasn't probably Jeroboam worshiping the calf. We dug a lot. Not me, I've never, well, that's not true. I did do a dig at Tel Dan. I did, and we looked for that golden calf, and we did not find it. They did, however, find a stela that I'll tell you about at some point that mentions the house of David, at least according to many scholars. So that was interesting. I was not there that day. That happened about 6 years after I was there. But they dug, and what did they find all over the Near East? Bulls. Big bulls, little bulls, bulls who climb on rocks, fat bulls, skinny bulls. Maybe you don't get the reference. Okay. They found all kinds of bulls, and what they found out about the bull, and then from other texts and manuscripts, and even inside the Bible, is that bull imagery was heavily associated with the god El, a northern Canaanite god, who ultimately later, and we'll learn about the origins of Yahweh, merged with Yahweh to become our God. Adonai Eloheinu, Yahweh El, one God. That was his throne. So what was Jeroboam doing? He was setting up a throne. There were bulls in the temple in Jerusalem, and no one said they worshipped them. Hell, there was actually more than bulls in Jerusalem. They had little sphinxes. The priests in Jerusalem were really into these little sphinxes. They had them over the Ark of the Covenant. Now, they didn't call them sphinxes, they had a different name for them. Anybody know what they called them? Cherubs. They were cherubims. There's something called form criticism. I'm not going to go too deeply into this, which means trying to understand the pre-literal sources. So, when it comes to the two oldest sources that we have, that I'll talk about in a minute, which we'll be talking about a lot, we don't think somebody sat and made up the story of Abraham and wrote it down. This was not a novelist at a typewriter or even with a quill. These stories are clearly older than the date on which they were written. They had to have been circulating for a very, very long time. We cannot possibly know what, if anything, they historically refer to. But they do seem to be far more ancient than their writing. One of the reasons we think that is because there seem to be competing versions. if we even just take a look at the two oldest texts, which are J and E, and you'll see why they're old, if we just look at those, we see some, I already told you about this, wife-sister narratives. They've got competing versions, and they're different, and they're told about different patriarchs. The relationships that were created from them seem to have already been in existence at the time that the stories were written. So that is to say that Abraham is already Isaac's father, who is already Jacob's father, by the time they're writing them down. But the stories themselves seem to be talking about characters who are not related sometimes, who have their own independent narratives. And a lot of that you can get from even later books of the Bible. Because believe it or not, we have in later books, in Psalms, in weird places, we have little tiny mentions of characters that don't align with the Torah version or any of the many Torah versions. What you learn from that, for instance, is Abraham. Almost everything he does is in the south. Was he originally a southern hero? Was he originally an independent narrative strand that was combined later with a northern hero that we know to be Jacob? What does Jacob's name change to? Israel. Well, that tells you right there who Jacob's identified with. He lives up north. Abraham seems to live down south. Could he really have been his grandfather? So this is what this kind of criticism does. Then we get into source criticism. Now, we've mentioned J, E, P, and V, and we're going to talk about them a lot as we get into the specifics of what we know. But these critics, they try to identify all kinds of things. The Ten Commandments, for instance, they don't seem to be specifically the product of any of these four schools. They seem to be almost independent, and then having been worked on and changed and adapted for later. There's a lot of reasons we think that. Then there's something called redaction criticism. This is where we try to understand the book as a whole. We won't be dealing with that a lot. There's literary criticism. Everybody here who's ever been to college or read a novel knows what literary criticism is. It's when you try to understand what things are representing. That's important. We won't be doing it as much, but that's analysis of plot and character, point of view, etc. And then there's little other versions too. Everything from what we call canonical criticism, how did the whole thing come together, to reader response criticism, to feminist criticism even, where they try to recover the lost voices of women in the text, which is something that's very peripheral from what we're able to do here. So this is where we're going to end today. Next time, we're going to talk about the traditions about the origins of Israel. What did the Jews themselves think about where, or the Israelites think about where they came from? And then we're going to talk about probably one of the most fascinating parts of this whole course. Where did we really come from? Where did the Israelites really come from? Whether it's we or our, because we're not necessarily genetically connected to these people, but where did the Israelites really come from? Where did they form? Under what conditions? That's important because they were the ones who wrote these tales. Okay, I hope you guys are enjoying this. I hope I didn't go too fast. Thanks for coming. Now, I've got handouts here. These are strictly for reference. They are timelines of ancient Near East, Judah and Israel. They also associate these periods with texts and with archaeological discoveries. We will not really refer to them all the time, but they are handy because they have the years and then they have what the event was and they have some of the other stuff. So I will leave these here. If we run out, I'm going to make some more next time. Yeah, they're just right here for anybody who cares. I think I have like 25, so there's definitely not enough for everybody.
So, well, you can maybe I